My house is just a couple of 100 meters away from a small church in the suburb. Although I was raised in a Christian family, I was never very religious and only attended that church whenever my parents took me as a child. My father died when I was a teenager, and after that, we stopped going to church as a family altogether. After that, I only went whenever my friends invited me along. Now, at 21, I only pass by the church when I have to go into the city, as there's a dirt road next to it that leads to the parking lot behind it. This lot is adjacent to a major road, making it easy to catch a bus to work. It was closer than the village gate in the opposite direction, and I only had to take one bus from there. I'm not an easily frightened person, nor have I previously experienced lasting trauma from fear. However, I am here to tell you that what I saw beside that church 3 months ago still haunts me to my core. A storm was announced earlier that week, but when I left for work on that early Thursday morning, the skies were clear, not a single cloud to cover the starry sky. So, I didn't bring an umbrella. I climbed over the parking lot gate because it was chained shut until 6 for the first Mass. The guard at the outpost didn't mind because the church staff knew my family pretty well. I work at a hotel as a line cook, and it's a very demanding job. I have to leave home before sunrise, and most days, I work long after the sun has set. The only time I get to see the sun is if I'm assigned to a station at the buffet where we have a view of the poolside. It was an average, overworked, and underpaid kind of day for me. I wasn't assigned to the buffet line, so I stayed in the kitchen where there weren't any windows. I was surprised to see the flooded streets when I clocked out. Apparently, it had been raining heavily all afternoon, and it subsided around sunset. It was around 8 o'clock in the evening when I left the hotel, and in my country, flooded streets means standstill traffic for at least a couple of hours. This wasn't that uncommon. I had dealt with similar situations before. It also meant I could sleep on the bus, so it wasn't that upsetting. Fast forward to around midnight, and it was pouring out again. I wasn't too far from the church parking lot, so I decided to get off the bus and start walking because it hadn't moved for the last 10 minutes. I put my phone and wallet in my waterproof backpack, which also contained a spare shirt, my house key, and my knife set. I didn't mind getting wet at that time. The parking lot gate was already chained shut, but I climbed over it like I usually do. The lot was flooded knee-deep, and there was no security guard at the outpost. I figured he had retreated into the church. It was really dark, but I focused on the small amount of light coming from the houses in the distance. They looked like dots from that far away. I trudged my way through the open parking lot, which could have passed as a kiddie pool, when I heard a strange sound in the far corner to my left. Due to the heavy rain, I couldn't clearly make out what was there, but I knew that I wasn't alone. All the lights in the lot were off, and the only things guiding me were the few lights of the houses far ahead. In my memory of the area's landscape, it's a straight shot from a dirt road, so I didn't have to worry about a light source. The sound of all the falling raindrops accumulated into a dull static noise, so it was easy for me to hear that there was something going on in that corner. I could see the shape of a person who seemed to be sitting down, so I could only see from the waist up. As I got closer and my eyes adjusted better to the dark, I could tell that it was a woman because of her long hair and curvy outline. She was flailing her arms and splashing the water around, grunting as she pounded her fist into the water. She was about 2 car lengths away, so I wasn't too concerned about it. I had dealt with crazy people before. I glanced over a few times as I passed her, then I reached the dirt road, which was quite unnerving. She was out of my line of sight at this point, and the mud made it hard to walk. The water was only ankle-deep now, but I kept having to jerk my foot free after each step because my shoes would sink into the mud. A small splash made me look over my shoulder, and in the darkness of that dirt road, the woman was face down in the shallow water. I froze, thinking about whether or not I should help her. I truly hated the thought of being the guy who let someone drown in water 6 inches deep. She was about 10 steps away from me, and before I could decide what to do, she started to move. It was too dark to see any details, but her outline was distinguishable enough for me to see that she was looking up at me. She slowly got on her hands and knees as if she was about to stand. but her hands lingered on the ground. I was already scared pale at this point. My legs didn't work, and I thought of reaching for my knives, but I was afraid to move. Then she started crawling toward me on her hands and knees. This sent a jolt through me, and all of a sudden, I was sprinting toward my house. I could hear the splashes behind me along with her coarse breathing, almost like she was coughing. My eyes started filling with tears, and the rain against my face made the lights in the distant houses blurry. But I knew that at that point, I was running for my life. I couldn't tell if she was catching up, but I didn't have it in me to look back. I heard her yell in a voice so rough it resembled a pig's squeal, short, sharp, and loud. A wordless shout of anger. I believe that was the fastest I ever ran in my life. At this point, I couldn't hear anything but the rain, deafening, unrelenting, and violent. My house was close. I sped by a few houses with their dim porch lights, and I could tell that I was running on sheer adrenaline. I didn't know when it happened, but apparently I lost my shoes back at the dirt road. One last bend, and I was at my doorstep. Finally, I forcefully tore my backpack zipper open and fumbled around the inside for the key, frantically looking around to see if she was still chasing me. I got in the house, slammed the door shut, and collapsed. I don't recall the rest of that night, but when I woke up the next morning in my bed, my older brother filled me in. He was awake when I got home that night, and went to the front door when the noise alerted him. He said I was on my knees, leaning against the door, quietly sobbing to myself. He woke my mom, and they were trying to console me, but I wouldn't talk. They tried to ask me questions, but I would just shake my head. They got me into some dry clothes and led me to my bed. Over breakfast, I explained what happened, and my mom said she'd notified the village guards. I could tell that they were concerned for my safety, but they didn't understand the fear I felt. My brother even joked about it. I didn't go to work that day. In fact, I took the rest of the week off because I caught a fever. The guards did a minor investigation and even increased patrols for a while, but they didn't find anything except for my shoes in the parking lot. I can't walk alone anymore without glancing over my shoulder every 5 seconds. Sudden loud noises make my heart jump, and I can't even stand the sound of rain. I've been getting better though. I can sleep with the lights off now. I just wish I could stop seeing the crawling woman's shape when I start drifting off to sleep. I wish I could tell you more about her. I honestly do, because it's one thing to be afraid of something, but when you lack the understanding of what you fear, your mind fills in the blanks with terrifying detail. After a whole year of starting university, I returned home for the summer. Our home, which still is just outside a quiet little town surrounded by dense forests. In those woods, there was a small man-made lake that diverged from a river extending for several miles through the woods, branching off into a few streams east of the lake. Next to my home, there was a small grassy path leading to the river, following a gentle stream. It was a long walk, but one I often took as a child. I knew the woods quite well and knew the places where I could cut through the dense trees to reach the stream. That walk always took me off the path, which slowly turned northwest, away from the stream, and then sharply bent west after several miles. By that point, the stream was hidden deep within the forest. I would continue walking north, following the stream through the woods until I reached the river, then follow the river west until I got to the lake. Honestly, it's pretty easy to get lost in this forest because the terrain isn't just a slope down to the water, it goes up and down, leaving you completely surrounded by trees. However, I spent many days wandering around there alone or with my dad over the span of 18 years, and I never saw anyone else in that forest. This summer, I visited twice, both times alone. The first time, I set out in the morning, walking along the pathway from the stream to the sharp bend, then cutting back into the forest. I reached the stream after about an hour. As I ran my hands through the water, I heard a distant bell ringing from far away in the north. Something was ringing a bell fervently and periodically, which struck me as strange. I listened closely, wondering if it might be a lost hunting dog, and I started moving toward the sound. But soon I realized it couldn't have been an animal. The bell sounded too heavy. It was too clear to be on a collar. I kept moving, and the bell seemed to fade away from me, stopping completely after about 5 minutes. The stream also wasn't big enough or strong enough to carry a bell that could have been caught in it. I thought of everything, but nothing explained the sound, except for one obvious thing that I just didn't feel comfortable with for some reason. I knew it had to be a person, but I stopped thinking about it and walked on normally until I came across a badger, an obviously dead one, carefully decapitated. It was clear that this had been done with a knife, and it was fairly fresh. The body was still limp, and there wasn't too much smell coming from it. The wound was filled with maggots, but I knew that was something that happened soon after exposure. The sound of the bell had been following the stream, just as I had, so perhaps the badger was placed there or at least killed there while I was walking that way. I suppose I don't really know, but nothing else happened that day. A week later, I went back for the second time that summer, and it was the last time I would ever go. I left home around 6 p.m., made it to the stream, and then walked to the river in about an hour. I then decided to return the way I came because it was getting late, and it started to rain heavily. The sun set around 9 p.m. I was walking as fast as I could, the sound of the rain in the trees feeling surreal and loud. I kept my head down and trotted through the clearest and most open part of the forest when I bumped into something heavy. The smell was sickening. It was the decomposing body of the badger, its head tied to the front of its paws, swinging from a tree. It was a putrid mass of stench, wet and dripping with green liquid. I started gagging, feeling as if some kind of mucus-like fluid was in my hair. It was just repulsive. At first, I simply stared at it, but then I began to fidget violently because I felt like I was drenched in its juices. I was already soaked from the rain, and my senses became confused. It felt like a bucket of ice-cold water had been thrown over me when I realized that I had taken the same route to reach the river. Someone had strung up the body after I passed it on the way there. Someone knew I would see it, so was someone watching me, running around in the forest? The faint sounds of branches breaking around me weren't from animals. I looked around and started jogging. I was half running, half walking away from the stream back toward the path for a while when I heard the bell again. I proceeded to call my dad while running. I told him to meet me at the path where it sharply turned west. It was the closest point on the path to me. I urged him to hurry and told him that someone was in the forest. I can't explain the feeling I had. It was like something was twisting my intestines and stomach. I literally felt the hairs on my neck stand up despite being soaked. It was dark, and I jogged as fast as I could. I was panicking because the path still felt a bit far away, too far to feel safe. It was still raining, and every sound was muffled. I felt as if everything was farther away than ever before. The bell rang for what felt like much longer than the last time, on and off, and I felt like it was surrounding me. At one point, the fear, combined with my impaired hearing and the fact that I couldn't breathe properly, started to make me lose my sense of direction. I knew I was heading southwest, but I wasn't really sure what I was doing. I was breathing hard, coughing like I was about to cry out loud, tripping over leaves and twigs like an idiot, but I stayed on the phone with my mom, who was on her way with my dad. I kept hearing sounds, but I wasn't sure what they were. My mom was also screaming on the phone at the same time, telling me that they were on the path and that I needed to run fast. I was as terrified as one could imagine, so I went into survival mode. I was doing the half-running, half-speed walking thing again because I was out of breath, but then I heard branches breaking and clear footsteps for the first time from deep within the forest, along with the bell ringing louder. I didn't want to look, but I turned over my shoulder, and that's when I saw the figure in the forest with me, a tall silhouette creeping in my direction at the very end of the clearing, ringing the bell slowly in front of its stomach. I could tell it was staring straight at me. Now I don't know if I suddenly had a hidden ability to sprint, or if I was fueled by instinctual adrenaline, but when I tell you I ran for my life, I didn't look back even once. I screamed as loudly as I could. "I'm on the phone with the police! They're on the path, Dad! I can see you! I'm here!" I wanted to yell, "Dad, please, where are you?" but I kept that part to myself. I felt like something awful was about to happen, and I sensed that the man was right behind me. I just kept telling myself not to look back. I was gasping and wheezing, crying so hard and screaming for my dad. I even dropped my bag, only realizing I didn't have it anymore when I was in the car. I felt like my phone was my only way home. Everything no longer felt real. It was like my legs were moving on their own. I didn't know if the man was still following me. I could only hear my heart beating in my ears and the bell ringing. Finally, I heard my dad shout my name, and I knew he was coming my way because I could feel the tone of his voice. When we reached each other, I practically lunged at him, and my dad heard the bell too. My mom could hear it on the phone as she waited with the car, ready to leave fast. On that foggy night in a remote town in Canada, my friends and I gathered together. The town was old and filled with abandoned buildings, steeped in eerie tales about what might happen within those empty walls. Each of us felt bored with our daily routines, so we decided to do something unconventional: explore these deserted buildings. In previous years, we had experienced strange happenings in these places, but nothing particularly terrifying had ever occurred. Occasionally, we would find small patches of a liquid that resembled blood, and sometimes there were odd symbols on the ground. However, those experiences paled in comparison to what we were about to encounter. I tried to recall memories from my childhood when I used to attend a daycare that was part of a mental hospital. It was a bizarre combination, I know, but it was a part of my life. Over time, that place closed down due to a lack of patience and children. I felt nostalgic about visiting that site again, so I went with my friends for our adventure. When we arrived, the atmosphere was exhilarating. A thick fog enveloped the area, and light rain was falling. I looked at the main gate, which was securely locked, and then we decided to jump over it. Laughter and chatter filled the air as we helped each other overcome the obstacle. We had no idea what awaited us. We entered the playground, which was abandoned, and pulled out our flashlights to explore. Even with our lights, visibility was limited. As we walked towards the decaying building, the crunch of glass under our feet echoed in the silence. Old toys and torn dolls were scattered around, as if time had frozen there. As we wandered through the daycare area, our voices faded into a heavy silence. The atmosphere grew tense, and with each step, we felt an increasing unease. While walking, I spotted a plastic container with crayons in a corner, so I decided to pick it up. Suddenly, we heard a loud crash coming from behind a metal door, causing us to freeze in our tracks. I glanced at my friends, fear etched in our faces. Brian, one of the bolder members of our group, suggested we check out the noise. I wasn't too keen on that idea, but I felt obliged to go along with my friends. We gathered at the door and managed to pry it open with effort. As we stepped inside, the metallic scent mingled with something else I couldn't quite identify. The tight hallway seemed to close in on us, making it difficult to breathe. Brian directed his flashlight into a room, and we all halted as he entered slowly. "What's going on?" I asked him, my voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I saw someone here, but it seems fine now," he replied. To be honest, I thought he was just trying to mess with our heads to increase our anxiety. Brian stepped back, and we continued deeper into the psych ward until another friend urged us to stop. We came to a halt, listening intently. In the distance, we heard the faint patter of footsteps echoing through the hallway. We exchanged fearful glances, our hearts racing. Brian pressed on toward the sounds, and for a fleeting moment, we considered turning back without him, wondering if some ghost or other entity had invaded the building. But we couldn't abandon him. As we got closer, I felt an unsettling sensation as though someone were watching us. Finally, we entered a room on the right, and the smell of rotting meat hit us like a wall. There lay a dead deer, its innards spilled across the floor, staining the concrete. One of my friends, who had a weak stomach, promptly vomited at the horrific sight. That's when we heard the whispers. The unsettling sound seemed to come from nowhere. Brian swung his flashlight toward the corner of the room, revealing a man standing there with his head bowed. He wore a bright green shirt, stained with what I assumed was blood, and ragged beige pants. He was barefoot, and his feet looked injured. He twitched sporadically, mumbling to himself even as we stood there in shock. We stared at him for what felt like an eternity until he made his first true movement. He lifted his head and grinned at us in a way that sent chills racing down our spines. "Are you here for the feast?" he asked. His words sent us over the edge. We bolted out of that room and raced back to the daycare center. The door was still ajar, and we desperately tried to slam it shut, but the rust and sheer weight of the door made it nearly impossible. It took 3 of us pulling with all our might to close it, and just before we succeeded, I caught a glimpse of the man's silhouette watching us, his white teeth the only feature visible in the dim light. We huddled behind the metal door, gasping for breath as we exchanged frantic glances, seeking confirmation that we had all seen the same terrifying figure. After several moments of heavy breathing, we heard a light tapping on the door. That was when we knew it was time to leave. We sprinted away from the vicinity and ran all the way home. A year later, after our visit to that place, the police returned for a routine search of the area and discovered the man. It was reported that he had once been a patient in the psychiatric facility before it closed. He had escaped from the facility he was transferred to and had been living off the wildlife surrounding the complex. When the cops apprehended him, he was suffering from various diseases due to consuming raw meat, and his mental condition was far worse than before. Rumors circulated that he had killed someone in the forest while searching for food, but nothing was confirmed. In the end, we learned that adventures in abandoned places are not just thrilling, they can harbor real dangers. So, be careful, especially in hazardous areas like abandoned buildings. Every time I look back at those dark corners, I remember that terrifying night, realizing that sometimes, the secrets of the past are more frightening than we can imagine. It was early November, cold and rainy, and around midnight. My fiancée, Wella, and I were looking for a new adventure, as we often did. We loved to go out on spontaneous late-night drives, taking the car and heading down the main roads of our city, exploring towns we hadn't visited before. Sometimes these trips lasted for hours, making every minute filled with excitement. Our area is characterized by large forests and rural spaces that separate the cities and towns. I live in a big college town, but with just a half-hour drive, you can find yourself stuck on an unmarked road in the middle of nowhere, or in small, obscure villages that hardly anyone knows about. So, it was all quite thrilling, which is why we loved these adventures. That night, as midnight approached, I felt a slight unease. We were wandering in an unfamiliar place, and Wella, with her keen sense of direction, was searching for the road using my phone. We were driving on a muddy path in a rural area, with clouds gathering overhead, pouring rain and thick fog that made my car's headlights struggle to illuminate the road ahead. Wella mentioned that she thought we were close to 200th Street West, a well-known road that leads to an area we recognized. However, after half an hour of driving, we hadn't seen any sign of it. Normally, we enjoyed these drives, but that night, I sensed something unusual. I glanced at Willa and noticed the tension in her eyes. I wondered if we had passed 200th Street without realizing it. I felt anxious about turning back, but we couldn't reverse without hitting a tree or landing in a ditch. Then, after about 10 minutes, we spotted a narrow road branching off up a hill, so I made a quick turn onto it. The road was very tight, with branches and twigs scraping against the car doors. As we reached the top of the hill, we found ourselves in a wide, paved clearing, with a house at the far end, nestled among thick woods. My gaze wandered over the property, illuminated by our headlights, revealing a scene of utter disrepair. The house was decrepit, with shattered windows and peeling paint, and the yard was littered with debris, old car parts, tools, trash, and hundreds of glass bottles. It was as if the house was overwhelmed by nature, with every inch entangled in vines and weeds. Suddenly, Willa pointed out little moving shadows and glowing spots around the yard. There were dozens of cats watching us, their eyes glimmering in the headlights. My heart raced when a walnut-sized rock suddenly darted out from the bushes and hit the windshield, shattering the glass. Willa screamed, clutching my arm, her voice trembling. "Denny, what was that? Oh my God, what just happened?" As the rain poured down in torrents, dark streams cascading from the trees over the house and across the pavement, I felt the blood drain from my face. Just then, a man stumbled out from the bushes, carrying a shovel, dressed in a dirty navy coat with a beard. But that was only the beginning. As we stood frozen in fear, the screen door of the house creaked open, and all the cats scattered. A tall, thin woman crawled out onto the porch. Her wild, gray hair was long and unkempt, and she was positioned just high enough that our headlights didn't reach her eyes. She wiped her unusually dark hands on her skirt, and I couldn't shake the image of how dark they were from my mind. In a panic, I slammed the car into reverse, rolling over cinder blocks and branches, screeching back down the road. Willa was still screaming and hitting the door lock repeatedly. Once we put some distance between us and that house, I felt a slight relief. However, as we finally exited the woods and hit a long, straight stretch of road, I noticed headlights behind us. A knot formed in my stomach when I realized the same vehicle was mimicking our every turn onto different roads. After nearly half an hour of being pursued, we finally reached a gas station that had a few other cars parked outside. I watched the vehicle pass by and saw that it was the same old Chevy truck from the house. It had followed us all the way to the next town. We waited until the truck disappeared down the road before getting out to grab some food and ask for directions home. I found myself glancing at the rearview mirror more than I did at the road ahead. When we got back home in the early morning, my teeth wouldn't stop chattering until I finally fell asleep. That night remains one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, and it taught us to always be cautious, even in our spontaneous adventures. Those events will stay etched in my memory, a reminder that danger can lurk in the shadows during every adventure.